Ja, das sind ja auch. Oh, doch, ein Teil der würde. Das hier soll ich tragen. Hello, test. Hi, Lauren. You are so far our only visitor here. Maybe we should write in the chat. Okay, now we can. Yeah, perfect. So, may I adjust it a tad here?
And you're going to mute it, or should I mute it from here for now?
Mute it, yeah.
Okay, so you can. Good. So I won't go to the bathroom.
Oh, wait. No, yeah. But it's only short.
Ah. Okay. What? Oh, like the TED Talk thing. Hey, how's it going? Hello. Good to meet you. How you doing? Welcome.
And can you hear me okay? Okay, very good. So thank you everyone for joining us today, whether that be here in the audience or those of you who are in your Zoom boxes. Welcome to this special edition of Mindvoyage, which is a lecture series that features prominent scholars from different disciplines, including the humanities, biology, neuroscience, and physics. Talks are dedicated to engaging in discussions related to novel, distinct, and often controversial topics. So my name is Tanya Brown, and I work here at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics as a member of the Cogitate Consortium, which is an international group looking to accelerate research on consciousness. But today we have the honor of hosting Dr. Randy McIntosh, the director at the Institute of Neuroscience and Neurotechnology at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, Canada, as well as being the co-lead of the Virtual Brain, which is an open source modeling platform for simulating brain dynamics. And formerly, Randy was the director at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest in Toronto, which is where I came to know him and his work. Randy is one of the most multi-dimensional people I know. As someone, among all of the various professional dabblings of Randy, he also finds time to hone his musical talents, both instrumental and vocal. But in the list of all things that Randy does, the one that's most significant to me personally is that he was my former supervisor as I worked with Randy as a member of his lab with the Virtual Brain project for some 11 years. So since then, Randy has then moved to the west coast of Canada to start up an all-new Neuroscience and Neurotechnology Institute at SFU. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have him here as my worlds collide, as we hear his more about his latest work at the intersection of brain and music. The way we'll do this today is Randy will come up and do his talk. We'll follow by a Q&A, for which we'll welcome questions from you in the audience. I'll come around with the microphone, and we will also be happy to have some Q&As from the Zoom chat. And for those of you who are here, you're invited to stay for coffee and tea afterwards and mingle with Randy if you have any more specific questions. So with that, Randy, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tanya. Cameras, angles okay on the webinar? I'm a little taller than Tanya, so yeah. Do that. While you're doing that, I'll get some water. There we go.
I think someone of you just joined the Zoom, right? You see his picture. Up a little bit. All right.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining me today, joining us today. Presentation today is a little bit experimental in the sense that, as Tanya said, this is an intersection between a lot of my interests, and there's a theoretical motivation, which I'll talk about in a minute, having to do with hidden repertoires in the brain. And there's emerging theories or evidence, if you will, that these hidden repertoires are quite important for the evolution of cognitive function, for the resilience of cognitive function, and potentially as a way to understand how people respond to things like brain damage or disease. And so what I'll try and do is cover these points, and again, we can talk about them as we go forward. So this is the abstract for my talk, and I didn't get water yet, so I'm gonna do that. Just hang on a second, okay? The abstract is really a roadmap for how I'm going to do the presentation today. So I will walk through the abstract with you and cover the major points that will talk about the intersection between the theory underlying hidden repertoires, the application of the theory, and then some ideas for the future of how we could use this framework to understand different aspects of brain function. So let's start with music and make some observations about music. Music is ubiquitous. There are very few cultures across the planet that don't have some form of music. Now, this next comment is a bit controversial, is whether does music and performing actually engage a broader set of regions, a broader set of brain networks than something like language function. We can debate that if you wish. But the broader engagement opens the possibility of identifying key personal brain signatures. And this is the idea that's quite important about music. For those of you who study music, you know that there's a personal aspect to music that's very tangible. You can play the same piece of music and no one will actually respond to it the same. And that's great, because that actually shows you that you have the physical features of the music, which are the same for everybody, but how you respond is very personal. And that's a key thing about music. And so, so this potential for having this evolution of music and the flow of how you perceive music does mesh well with this evolving theory of what are called structure flows and manifolds, and the notion that these manifolds that are representations of how your brain dynamics evolve is a way to capture the potential for your brain. So the notion of hidden repertoires and the notion of structure flows and manifolds is an idea that's been around for roughly a decade now. The idea was originally put forward by Victor Yersa and colleagues through several different papers. There's a really strong core mathematical foundation for it that really talks about dynamical systems and complexity and complex systems, and how you can characterize complex systems based on a deterministic architecture, if you will, or a manifold. So I poured it and didn't drink it yet. Now I'm actually feeling much better. So structure flows and manifolds is really trying to derive a way of characterizing the rules that determine how brain networks can evolve over time. These are flows. So the structured part of it is a manifold, and then within the manifold, certain trajectories or flows can evolve. And the manifold constrains the rules, but the ways those flows evolve can change depending on things like initial conditions, noise, background, etc. And what this does is it takes us away from emphasizing what happens when we measure someone's brain in the moment, and thinking about that measurement as one of many possibilities of how that person's brain could have evolved in a given situation. So we focus not just on what the person is doing now and what the brain looks like, but what is the possible repertoire of things that that person can do. And that's the notion of hidden repertoires. And so what is a hidden repertoire? A hidden repertoire arises when the distribution of parameters underlying state space. So state space is basically the configuration of parameters that push a flow or a set of network configurations around. So the parameters that characterize the state space enables configurations, that are possible but seldom realized. So for the brain, these functional configurations are possible for a given architecture, but seldom visited. And it might be that the particular hidden configuration could be either redundant, inefficient, or potentially also maladaptive. So if we give an example here, we've got sort of the starting space where we've got a symmetrical network where these things are all connected and equally connected. And as the system evolves, we can say, for example, in development or through experience, certain functional architectures are enabled. So here we got a flow going up here, with these ones are not active. Here we have another potential flow here and here, but these ones are not active. And then we have another one that's enabled. And that one, through evolution of time, is possible because of the architecture, but like I said, it's maybe seldom visited because, again, it might be maladaptive, it might be redundant, it might be inefficient for a given task. So in complex systems, those of you who know about complexity in complex systems, there is this notion that the system is always checking for potential configurations that it can use. And that continual checking, it gets reinforced and built in. So it can check configurations that are possible, but maybe not ideal for a given situation, but it has been visited. So it's stuck back sort of as a catalog of potential configurations that can be done. Are we having problems with the webcast? I was just noticing the screen kind of went voot on the local feed. Are you okay, Tanya? You can see everything still? Yeah. Anyway, I think we're okay. I will continue. And so studying this, of course, is quite difficult because you can imagine to try and measure every functional architecture that your brain can enable, both when you're awake, when you're sleeping, when you're walking, when you're sitting in this room listening to me talk, would be an enormous, probably impossible task. So one way of actually being able to achieve that or get close to measuring that is by combining empirical work with things like computational modeling. So that is a platform that this virtual brain platform that Tanya mentioned in the introduction is a platform that allows you to do that. For those who don't know, it was introduced roughly 2012 and has been going now for about 10 years and change. It's an open source platform. It allows you to use empirical data to construct models that are based on a person's brain. So you can download it. This is the website here. It operates on all major platforms, including high performance computing systems, as well as laptops. So it's quite flexible that way. These are the people responsible for this thing. There's myself, Petra Ritter in Berlin, and Victor Yersa in Marseille, as well as a cast of 1,000 other people who contributed various aspects to the code. But the important thing here is it does allow you to construct a network, the structural part of the network, essentially the manifold, and then introduce dynamics that allow you then to see the flows through this model. So in the early parts of this work, we started trying to figure out what does intrinsic activity in the brain mean. Intrinsic activity, for those of you who do fMRI work, for example, could be thought of as the resting state networks. So there's been a lot of work, as you might know, looking at what people are doing when they're just lying in the scanner and sort of ruminating about being in the scanner. It's also being used now for MEG and EEG, less so, but there is this notion that you can measure sort of intrinsic activity in the brain. So work done by a number of people. This is a review from Gustavo Deco, Victor Yersa, and myself, just talking about the models that have been derived. And one of the important points about looking at this intrinsic activity is that all of the evidence in terms of the modeling work, at least, was suggesting that the formation dissolution of resting state patterns reflects the exploration of possible functional network configurations around a stable anatomical skeleton. So again, getting back to this notion of manifolds, it could be that the stable anatomical skeleton is giving you a way to capture what the manifold is. And then the rumination, this intrinsic activity, are the flows that are enabled by the manifold. So the brain is essentially exploring what the possible configurations are in a given situation. So again, a lot of work has been done around that. This is sort of the workflow for virtual brain very quickly, where you take structural MRI to get a person's geometry. You use diffusion tensor imaging to get the idea of the structural connectivity. You introduce dynamics using some sort of what's called a mean field approximation, where you can put in oscillators at the given nodes, or you can put in spiking neurons or population level activity as well. There's about 29 different versions that can be put in there. You can stimulate the model, and then using forward solutions, generate the same kind of empirical data that you measure on the individual. So you can use that as a data fitting target. For example, generating fMRI, generating MEG, EEG, intracranial EEG, and using that as a target to fit to the individual models. And that's how you get the personalization. And so down here, it's just a compilation of how one might do that. So this movie down here is just showing you get a personalized model by getting the person's cortical surface. You can import that digitally, obviously, into the model, triangulate that cortical surface, do a region of interest map on that if you want, or you can do a full surface model, identify the centers, identify the structural connections, again, using DTI, and then from there start doing things like simulating the forward solution. So you have the EEG electrodes, and then using the dynamics, you then impart a full functional model. Forward solution, this is what a simulated EEG data looks like projected onto the scalp. And then using the same model, you can generate fMRI bold. So you can then generate what the time series would look like if you measured fMRI in these different regions of interest. You can see it's hard to measure, but the time constant is actually a bit slower since it's fMRI. And then finally, you can generate the source activity. It needs to be local field potentials that would be generated at each of the sites. The key point here is that it's the same core model generating these different kinds of simulated data. So with that, of course, you can then start fitting. So you can fit, for example, if you measure the correlations of the time series or functional connections, you can compare the functional connections from the simulated data and the empirical data, and then do parameter optimization until you get a good fit to the model. This has been done over a number of different papers, just looking at what are the key features of how this internal rumination is generated. And what you find if you do this over a number of different studies is that we can simulate the repertoire, no problem at all. We do reproduce what you see empirically in terms of the resting state networks that are there. One of the key points in this exploration was that these resting state networks form and dissolve across time. They interact with one another. So these are the empirical resting state networks. These are the simulated resting state networks. If you look at their correlations across time using what is called the sliding window or functional connectivity dynamics, you find essentially a trajectory that gets formed in this broader manifold, where networks form one configuration and then spontaneously switch to another configuration. So we have sort of an alpha and beta state. Alpha being the strong correlation amongst these networks, beta being strong correlations amongst the other networks there. And this pattern of switching happens spontaneously. Again, it's like an exploration that happens in the brain. So that capacity tells us that we can at least get an idea of what's happening in the brain using dynamics. Flows can happen in behavior as well. Those of you who study behavior more directly know that behaviors like, for example, memory, attention, listening to music, talking are all flows across time. They don't happen as points, right? So if you're thinking about something, there's a process involved, a temporal process that evolves through them. The challenge in a lot of the experimental work, however, is if you look at memory, for instance, we typically measure memory with two different things. One is how fast you responded, and the second one is whether you're right or wrong, which is rather impoverished given what typically happens in your head, at least as you're doing these things. So how do we study the dynamics of behavior then? Well, you can do motor learning. Obviously, you can move stuff around. You can put dots on a person's body and do dance, for example, as well. All these things are possible. What else has temporal evolution across time that we can actually get an idea of? And that gets us back to music. That as we're listening to music, for example, our perception of that piece will change as the music evolves. And the question is, can we capture that? So that's a dynamical process. That is a flow. And the question is, can we capture the flow of the music as we are listening to it? This gets back to this last part here. Broader engagement of networks opens the possibility of identifying key personal brain signatures that reflect the capacity of brain systems to work together. This is a map that the main person involved in this project, Sarah Faber, who is with me at SFU now as a grad student. She had done a sort of a broad sort of survey of the work out there on music perception, primarily, a little bit on music generation as well, and mapped out the key areas that were out there in the literature. And you see that it is quite broad. I mean, we typically think about music as being sort of a right hemisphere thing, to be sort of, along with popular culture. But you do find when you look at the literature that music perception does involve both hemispheres. It involves more than just the auditory systems. You do get frontal areas involved bilaterally. You get medial areas involved as well, suggesting that you can in fact capture a large part of the brain system by looking at listening to music. So if we consider music as having a similar structure, flows, and manifold properties as the brain, a connection might be formed by linking the music and brain flows. So I'm presenting now some preliminary data that have come out of some work done over the number of years with Sarah as the lead on this particular part of the project. So, as I said, the challenge with this process is to figure out how do we capture the evolution of the perception of music as people are listening to it. What we did, and this is actually coming from my former voice teacher, Adrian McCulloch, is looked at the subjective response to music. And this can be done just sort of as an emotional thing, or it can be done as more sort of, I guess, easier to measure or easier to explain model where you look at arousal and valence and don't necessarily label it as being happy or sad. So this work has been done across a number of years, 30 or 40 years actually, where instead of thinking about whether you're angry or not, you just look at your current feeling and do you feel have a negative or positive valence, and are you highly aroused or low aroused? And you can sort of locate yourself in this space. So what we did is Andrea McCulloch generated for me a series of pieces. Don't bother looking at the details. They're all sort of classical, Western classical music pieces. And we had people listening to them both to convey the subjective arousal and valence. And then we had another condition where they were just looking at sort of the perceptual properties of the music, which would be pitch and tempo. So the task, they were listening to the music here. And they had the screen in front of them, where they had the screen broken up into quadrants. They have an EEG cap on. And as the music evolves, in particular, this particular case would be the arousal and valence part, they would trace out a trajectory of how they felt, where they placed themselves in this arousal and valence quadrants as they were listening to the music. Again, the same screen was up there for the perceptual part, but instead of arousal and valence, it was high and low tempo or low and high pitch. So these are, perceptual features that people, they hear it and make a decision immediately as whether it's fast or slow tempo. You cannot prevent them from having a response to music that's emotional, but it's more a question of what they're focusing on in terms of their internal states at that point in time. The experimental task, they're also looking at sort of mood and energy. So again, the same configuration of the screen, but they're looking at different parts of what they focus on internally. So they hear the thing and think about how it makes them feel, and then make a decision in terms of where they are in that space as they move around. Not surprisingly, people are different in how they do this task in terms of how they feel about it. This is true both within an individual across different pieces. And this is a heat map where people were tracing out with a cursor on a screen how they felt in terms of arousal and valence for different kinds of pieces. So there's Valkyrie here, Nixon, Nimrod. There's a Brahms piece in here, down bottom here. But you do see that across these pieces, this person is quite different in terms of how they respond, which tells us that we're getting a pretty good coverage of space. We can also look at individuals, and this is average across, in this particular case, 7 individuals. We had 20 altogether in the study. And again, you see people are quite different. There are some people who cover the entire space of that whole arousal and valence thing. Others are much more focal in terms of where they go in this task. So now we have a way of measuring dynamics in the brain with EEG. We have a way of measuring dynamics in behavior, at least in terms of the introspective part of it, which is tracing out how they feel as they're listening to the music. So we're getting a nice model here. We've got their affective response. We're measuring the brain. What we're missing now is this part here, the music part, which I'll get to in 1 second. So now we have to parse these data into something we can relate the flows in at least the two different data sets. And here what we did is use a technique called hidden Markov models, which is essentially a dimensionality reduction technique that allows you to extract spatial patterns in the data. In this case, we'll talk about brain patterns. And then using those spatial patterns to basically project back on the time course and reduce it to a smaller number of dimensions based on how these patterns interact with one another and are more present or absent across a particular period in time. So here we may have, for example, these are state presences. So we have 12 states here. This is time across the y-axis here. And these would be brain states. So what this would just indicate is what brain state was most dominant at a given point in time for listening to a particular piece of music. So in the brain part, we can use this dimensionality reduction and then EEG data where we did actually source space projection. There were 12 brain states that were identified as being the most dominant in the tasks. I'm not going to go through the details of them here, but just to indicate that there were 12. You can play with the number of dimensions, and this is actually where you get asymptotic fit for the data. You can look at, again, the states presence or absence. But also what's called transitional probabilities. So what is the likelihood from going between one state to another at a given point in time? So this is actually an asymmetric matrix where the colors indicate what the likelihood of going between one state and another. For example, this square here would indicate a probability of going from state 2, where's the next state you go to? And you have a high likelihood of going to state 1, for instance, and slightly stronger going back in the other direction. So it's an asymmetric matrix, and it tells you about how the person evolves across time, essentially how these brain networks are flowing as they're listening to music. So this is a great way of getting at that idea of flows in the brain part. Now let's look at flows in the music part. Those of you studying music might know about this thing called the Music Information Retrieval Toolkit, which is a platform that allows you to extract different features of music. And you go from very sort of low-grade perceptual properties of the music, like frequency, to much more coarse aspects of the music that have more complex features, for example, fluctuations, key strength, pitch, tempo, sustained release attack, etc. So we go from very, again, perceptual features like energy to the more complex features that relate more closely to the emotional response. Here's an example from the paper that's listed here, where they correlated the music features across different instruments and related it to how the valence of the response to the particular piece of instruments. And what you found, for example, is like low-pitched instruments like drums and cello had a more positive valence, whereas high-pitched things like primarily brass, horns, and things of that sort had a more negative valence, relatively speaking. So we can apply this filtering technique to each piece of music and then do the same thing as we did with the brain, put this into a hidden Markov model and see how do the different features interact for a given piece of music. And so we have 5 different states that emerge from the music, and we have perceptual features being very strong, dominant here, and then the more high-level features down here being clustered. You see that they change across the 5 states. So in the first 3 states, these are states that are primarily reflecting the perceptual aspects, that these are really, it doesn't matter where you play it, who you play it to, the perceptual features by and large will not change. Where here they're very context dependent. The higher level features do depend on the flow of the music, and that's going to hopefully again relate to the intrinsic component of it. And then the final thing is that we look at the mouse data, the tracker data. It's very low dimensional, so we really can't do much with it other than kind of just saying, where were you in the 5 quadrants? So the starting point here, and then these 4 quadrants. So we're going to use for the mouse data is just characterize sort of where did you go. So we get back to the model. Now it's complete. We have the acoustic features of the music, we have the brain data, and we have the behavior as it's measured using the mouse. This is all put together in a multivariate model called partial least squares, which I won't go through in any great detail, but basically we look at the correlations between these elements and how those correlations vary across subjects and how those correlations vary across tasks. So the way I'm going to show this to you is to focus on the decisions that people are making in terms of their behavior and the brain correlates. So how is the brain state? How are the brain states interacting across time? If you think about how this task might be done, when you start listening to the music, you're going to be in the middle at 0, and then you make your first movement. So that's going to be the making a decision about the perceptual component, making a decision about how you feel. And then there's a post-decision part that happens after that. Once you make that movement, what happens next? You keep on having that trajectory. And that's kind of how the data fell out in terms of the analysis. So you'll see this context-free and context-dependent aspect playing out there in terms of where it's most dominant in the flow of brain states. So are you ready? You guys on the camera, ready? This is the output. I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular slide, but this shows you the output of the model. The arrows indicate the weightings for transitional probabilities, dotted being stronger in the control condition and solid lines being stronger in the experimental condition. And we have those flows that were more dominant in the context-free aspect, and those are more dominant with the context-dependent aspect of the music states. What I'll do is I'll break this down into pieces and just emphasize the dominant parts of the outcomes. So if you look at sort of the part where you're starting in the middle of the set, you find for the control tasks, a lot of the interactions were happening with context-free states correlating with particular brain states. So again, not terribly surprising since you are focused on perceptual features. A lot of the interactions had to do with those parts, those brain states that were correlated with the perceptual aspects, and those were the ones that were dominant in the pre-decision part. In the experimental task, we've got a bit of both happening. We have the context-free states, which are related to the perceptual components, as well as interactions that are driven by the context-dependent states. So again, the arousal and valence is moving, correlating with the transitional probabilities amongst these networks, and much more dominant in the emotional condition or experimental condition initially. So you're evaluating essentially, how do I feel about the music? And those flows are being set up as you're making the decision. Once you make the decision, again, in the control task, it's primarily context-free states, a little bit in context-dependent, but again, it's basically staying in the same part. You've made the decision about pitch and tempo. It might be changing, so I'm just going to evaluate where the pitch and tempo are changing again. Experimental condition, you've got, again, a bit of both happening. You've got, again, the context-free states, which you kind of need to get the perceptual aspects working. But again, the context-dependent states are interacting to push the network flows across space and time. So it's a difficult thing to articulate in a talk of this length. We could spend a lot of time talking about the individual states, but I'm not going to do that. What I really want to show you is this is a proof of concept that we can now think about how to merge data from measuring brain states with the data that represent the transition of behavioral states with data that can be used to measure the transition in the input state, the music in this particular case. And that intersection is really key, I think, to understand how it is that we navigate the world, generally speaking. Music is a good example of how to do that because it has this richness that we can extract. But you can also imagine doing that in other cases. So not surprising, listening to music is more than just auditory regions. If anybody was surprised by that, then you shouldn't be, because it should be more than just that. In both cases, you're accumulating evidence before you make a decision. And this process involves networks, which is a good thing. And perceptual information requires context-free information, which is primarily perceptual. Emotional interacts with context-dependent information, and there's additional screening going on afterwards. So again, proof of concept that we can do this. We can consider now music as having these properties that have flows, and then we can link these together in terms of flows on manifolds that can be measured with the brain, flows on manifolds measured in the music, flows on manifolds that can be tapped into with behavior. So I promised one more thing in this talk. For those of you who read the abstract, this very last part, well, I'll finish with ideas of extending this particular framework to aging and dementia. This won't take too long. For those of you who are having a nap, you can wake up again and then talk about aging and dementia. If you think about what happens as you get older, I'm being one of those people who are getting older, for example, I notice things have changed in terms of how I perceive the world and how I navigate the world. For example, I forget stuff. Sometimes it's not my name, but sometimes it's like, who was this person I just met? Or what am I supposed to do right now? Or something like that. So you walk, for example, from your kitchen to the living room and forget why did you go into the living room, or vice versa. That's typically healthy aging. But you can think about that being more severe, of course, if you have some sort of age-related disease or disorder like dementia. I started with the quote at the beginning of the talk. I'm not sure if you really noticed that quote that was up there, but talking about the fact that people who have cognitive impairment, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, for example, if you play music to them, they all of a sudden come alive in ways that they weren't necessarily before they heard the music. And so the question becomes, can we use something like music to access hidden repertoire? So for example, if this is the configuration that's maintained and we lose this part here somehow, the access here, can we use a different set of networks to access a hidden repertoire that might be helpful in terms of maintaining or at least reestablishing some level of cognitive function? That's kind of the gold at the end of the rainbow, really. If we can do that, that could really change how we think about brain diseases and disorders, that we have symptoms that are reflecting a lack of an access to a particular part of our brain. And since we have this richness of network configurations that are enabled by the manifolds that exist, can we use different trajectories to get to different parts of that manifold that may not be accessible by the same paths we had early on in life? So there are suggestions that aging brings a shift in network dynamics, and that this shift may not result in any true cognitive decline in terms of the corresponding cohort. It does differ between groups. So for example, there's two papers here, one from Damien Battaglia using data from Petra Ritter's group, one from Joanna Cabral. I forgot where the data came from for this particular one. What we're showing here is what's called functional connectivity dynamics. And if you have blue versus orange, what that means is there's a lot of switching happening in terms of network configurations. You remember when I was mentioning the virtual brain and being able to measure these shifts across a manifold? Those shifts I showed you were actually from young individuals' data. It could be, for example, from this person, and showing you that they switch quite rapidly. This is a middle-aged person switching less. And then somebody who's in their 80s, you see that there's a lot of red here, which means the network configuration is not changing that much across time. And we find that that switch does in fact correlate with cognitive status. MoCA, for example, which is a measure of cognitive function, the less switching that you have, the lower your cognitive status is, relatively speaking, suggesting that switching is something that's important for maintenance of cognitive function. Switching here, again, comparing people who have high cognitive function versus low in aging, there's a particular path. This is very similar to the hidden Markov model approach I mentioned earlier. This is called LIDA, which is a similar technique using principal components analysis for decompositions. But you find, for example, for those who are in good health, they have a particular path of trajectories that are dominant, versus those who are not doing as well have a different path of trajectory, suggesting again that the flows will change across aging. So we can access these flows now and relate these flows to different aspects of cognitive function and potentially identify, again, hidden repertoires. A number of papers have looked at brain dynamics related to dementia. Not a surprise that with dementia, these dynamics change, whether it be dynamic functional connectivity, whether it be the short-lived states that happen within these sliding windows, and potentially also looking at using these metrics to predict who's going to transition to dementia. So the change in the state paths when you have mild cognitive impairment could actually predict how and when you can transition to dementia. At least that's the suggestion from this final paper that was published in the Frontiers in Neuroscience. So we got the idea that yes, brain states do change in terms of their flows in both aging and dementia. What about music? So I mentioned the anecdotal evidence that when you play music to people who have dementia, they seem to have a reemergence. This is in summary published in 2017 that kind of captures some of the major things that were known at that particular point in time. I should ask, these slides we could probably share somewhere as a PDF. So in case you want the references, you don't have to quickly write them down or take a picture, you'll get it later as well. So randomized control studies have shown that there's efficacy of music intervention in improving the well-being of people with dementia and their caregivers, importantly, as well. In my previous life, as Tanya mentioned, I was director of research at the Rotman Research Institute in Baycrest in Toronto. And Baycrest is a long-term care facility. So I got to see this in real life, to actually see people in music therapy sessions and see them emerging, if you will, from their cognitive impairment. Sarah Faber, who I mentioned earlier on, is actually a music therapist. So part of the reason she wanted to work with me was to get a better idea of why does music have this effect on people who have cognitive impairment, and can we use that in some way to improve their quality of life? So again, there's evidence from randomized trials that we can do this. Not all music abilities are spared. There. Now you can hear me, right? Apologies. Let me back up a second, just back to the dementia part. I'm still in the middle part, so you haven't missed much if you've not been listening or just watching my lips move. There is some suggestion that training, musical training, can delay cognitive impairment. And this probably gets into the idea that, using your brain more, education is another factor that seems to be important for preventing cognitive decline. It could be that music is in the same boat, or it could be that music, because it does engage a broader part of the brain, might provide you with more access, if you will, to hidden repertoires. There's a scale, I forgot what the acronym stands for. Actually, it's the Music and Dementia Assessment Scale, or MIDAS. Does provide a way of being able to tailor music interventions to the individual based on their tastes and the responsivity to different music types. So, to music dementia and network dynamics, you'll find that there's much less work here. As you can imagine, it's a difficult thing to measure, because unfortunately the tendency is to want to measure people in a scanner, fMRI scanner, and it's a difficult environment to get somebody in there to begin with, never mind having to listen to music and try and make some sort of judgments about it. Nevertheless, there are a scattering of papers that have done this, and they find variable results in terms of what they actually see. This particular one found that after people listened to their favorite music, there was increased functional connectivity for people with dementia. What that means, who knows? But it was at least showing that you can do that. But I get back to this notion that music does engage a lot more of the brain seemingly than other tasks might, and that engagement may in fact provide us ability to access different networks through what are called hidden repertoires again. So we could in fact test this using a very similar setup to what I mentioned earlier. We've got people listening to music and doing some sort of judgment. It could be, if they can do the task, they could do the task and do the arousal and valence. If they can't, just let them listen to music they like and music that they don't like, for example, or they don't know, and just compare those things directly. But the notion here is not just to look at the static parts, but to try and use a sort of a dynamical systems framework to understand flows in the brain, to understand flows in behavior, and how we link them together in the perception of music, and accessing hidden repertoires that might give us access to improving cognitive performance in those with dementia. So just to wrap up, the first question is, how do we know that music gives access to hidden repertoires? We don't. That's an open question, otherwise it wouldn't be here. But we could in fact, using again these techniques, is start modeling the brain, using things like virtual brain, and then looking at things like music and seeing if it's accessing networks in a way that other stimuli don't. We don't know if the benefits of music that are seen in the clinical trials or anecdotally are really the acting of existing repertoires or in the formation of new ones. It's become very clear in neuroscience now that the brain is continually rewiring itself across your lifespan. So brain plasticity is not something just for the young, it's something that everybody has. The degree of plasticity might change, but rewiring is possible in anybody's brain. So the question then becomes whether these benefits that one may see from things like music are because you're accessing existing repertoires, or are you actually forming new ones? And that's an unknown question. We can use things like the virtual brain to estimate the structure flows and manifolds. And I think there we can use individualized models using things like MRI and EEG to identify these flows. But the key thing is to make sure we have a good way of linking it to behavior. Because just saying that it changed from time point 1 to time point 2 and saying they look happy is really not satisfactory anymore. I think we have the tools to be able to look at the personal experience as best as we can and relate that to the flows in the brain. And that's really, I think, a key avenue that's worth exploring, because we can really open up a whole host of opportunities to look at different aspects of cognition different aspects of brain dynamics and really put these things together in new and interesting ways. So I'll leave you with this quote again. For those who didn't see it earlier, it's actually a quote from the daughter of a participant in a music therapy study, just saying that dementia robs people of their memories. Without memories, life lacks a great deal of meaning. Music therapy provides my mom and others with a few precious moments of pleasure and revives long forgotten memories. Music is a gift to these seniors. Thank you. Sure. Well, most of it's actually Sarah's work. I just kind of say yes, no, maybe. And then
we do have a couple questions coming in online, so maybe we'll start there, and then if anyone here has a question, I'll be happy to bring the mic over to you to give you some floor time as well. So we'll start with a question from Seung-gu Kim. She said, "This is really interesting." I agree. I would wish to learn more on how you relate the 5 MIR states. I think it might be MRI states.
No, it's MIR here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or 2 categories of them, and the 12 EEG states. Is it a temporal correlation between EEG transitions, example from state 1 to state 2, and the MRI transitions, example from state 3 to 4?
Yes, exactly. So what we do is using the hidden Markov approach, we get the time series into the same time stamps, so they have the same temporal resolution, and then just correlate them directly within individuals. So you take the individual's brain patterns and their state transitions, for example, and then correlate that with the, or actually transition probabilities for the brain states, and correlate that with the changing mirror states across time. So they're correlated directly within individual, and then analyze the cross individuals.
And then there was a follow-up to that question. I also believe neuroscientists would want to interpret the HMM states in order to understand what the differences in transitions would mean. Would it be similar to what we do with PCA, ICA spatial weights, example, arbitrary scales and signs?
Yeah, so I didn't spend a lot of time on the labels for the states. The labels, we tried to align the labels closer to what has been characterized in sort of, I wouldn't call them canonical resting state networks, but sort of the current labels that are used for resting state networks. So the 12 states roughly correspond to different intrinsic states, and you can label them that way. So the output of the HMM is very similar to what you get with PC, and ICA is just slightly different on how you get into that space.
Okay. Great.
Great. Thank you for the talk. Maybe following on from these questions, when I see EEG, I was almost expecting you to also talk about maybe oscillations, but then it was states in terms of activations. I don't know if it's worth maybe commenting why you chose locations of activation, as I understand it, and maybe oscillations at this point weren't included, or were they? I'm not sure.
Not in this. You can. Well, we stuck with the Aurora amplitude time series for this pass. In the HMM toolkit, you can break it down into frequencies as well. The only reason we didn't do that is just to add a lot more data, because instead you have to look at each individual frequency band, and it's changing, and the state configurations around those frequency bands. Okay. So it wasn't because we excluded it, we just had to try and make things as simple as possible. So it's really, and it's essentially looking at the functional connections of the time series and amplitude dimensions. Okay. So that's how the states are identified, and then their presence or absence is based on how strongly those are manifest across time within a given piece of music.
Great, thank you.
What?
Hello,
Hi.
my name is Maria.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for your talk.
Pleasure.
It was fascinating. And I have 2 small questions about the experiment. So first question is, what kind of music did you give to people to listen to.
Mhm.
Was it only instrumental one or also songs? And another question is about people participated in. So were they musicians, amateurs, or not at all musicians? And did it somehow affected the results?
Yeah, great question. So the music was a mix of instrumental and vocal and some combinations thereof. We had everything from ensembles to single pieces of music or single instruments, I should say, to full symphonies and then opera pieces as well. And that was done not because we wanted to make it more complicated to analyze, but actually just to get music that would really push people around in terms of their subjective responses. All the participants were young adults from about 18 to 35, I think it was. And actually Tanya was involved in some of the data collection. Tells you how long ago we started the experiment. We did assess musical experience in these individuals. There were some who had high levels of training and some who had none. And there was some correlation. We didn't look at this particular part, but there was another paper that was published on this a while back. This one was published in 2000 or 2020 that looked at a different aspect of the music, but we did look at, in this particular case, the correlation between things like how well the brain patterns match the music patterns and how that related to enjoyment of music, but also to music expertise. And there was a correlation between what's called complexity matching and expertise in music. But we purposely wanted to make it as broad as possible to really capture as much as we possibly could in terms of subjective responses. Some of the follow-up will be probably using things like music people are familiar with and not familiar with, and also trying to parse things based on music experience. But that's a much longer study, as you can imagine.
Thank you.
Just going to check the chat to see if any more questions came in through the Zoom.
Return a message. Yeah.
Yes. Do you want to read out the
We know that behavioral reports about valence and arousal, up there, can be delayed with respect to neural signals and music and acoustic stimuli. Do we consider this? In a particular case, no. And part of the reason we did not is because we downsample all the time series, so they're roughly in the same time stamp. So the delays are kind of smeared. That may happen. They will, in fact, all obviously be different because you'll have the internal response, the brain response, and then the brain response will push the behavior around. So there will be a delay. But since we downsampled the data in the same time frame, that's probably eliminated from the data.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I have two questions. A quick clarification question. What do you mean with compositional features in the higher?
Context-free, context-free and context-dependent features?
No, you were speaking about low level with a mere features.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's. I apologize for the changing in terminology. If we go back to, let me get back to the slide, but it has the, here we go. So the mirror features parse things into different aspects of the signal. So again, there's the perceptual aspects, things like energy and frequency. And then you have sort of the high level features, which things like tempo, pulse, clarity, and so on. Okay. So that's basically how they ended up parsing. So when you do that in the mirror features and parse them out into the HMM, the state space, you find that these low level features cluster together, and the high level features, compositional features, if you will, cluster together. And that's kind of how they fall out. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
I was wondering if it's part of the mirror toolbox or if it's more musical.
Well, it's more how we interpret what these metrics reflect in terms of the music.
Okay. And the second question is really out of curiosity. Are you doing similar work with other material like movies or other dynamic events?
I'm not. We're starting a collaboration with a group at BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver who are looking at movie watching in fMRI. in adults and kids. And the idea there is to try, because again, with movies, you can timestamp certain aspects of what happens in the movies and use that the same way we do here. So we're just starting that work right now.
And are you expecting like there is something specific to music or something that you will find in all kinds of
I mean,
materials?
personally, I think there is something specific to music. Just again, since I'm a musician as well, I like to believe that there is, but we can compare them. Let's just see, why not?
Thank you.
Any other questions in the room? I'll just check the chat one more time.
Yeah, this one came up.
Okay.
You want me to read it, Tanya?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. If we think of a closed loop system where an individual's mood state is monitored via EEG, and then the information is then used to generate music to boost individual's mood. Do you have any thoughts on how that music generation could work? No, I don't. That is something that people have been looking at. So trying to use the internal states to generate, like to guide either the creation of music or to guide how music evolves. I think we're not quite there yet to know that relationship, because I made the point about subjectivity of music, and that's a very important part, is that we can't rely on just averages of state flows to know how that person responded. And that's why that subjectivity is really what makes music unique, is that people do respond differently to the same piece of music. And that subjectivity is what makes music difficult to study, but also what makes music a fun thing to study, because you really get at the personal aspect of experience.
I have another question, if there's still time, about the continuous ratings. So firstly, maybe how you define then felt energy and valence, maybe and how well you could see that they were differentiating between the music and how they felt. And I guess I was really impressed with how broad the continuous ratings were, because in some cases it can be very difficult to continuously rate how you feel. So maybe if you could go into this, and also the acoustic ratings, did you also include this in the model when they were looking at the low pitch, high pitch tempo as well? Maybe just outline this.
Yeah, so again, this is an individual's ratings, right? You see that they do vary quite a bit. There's some that they just sat in this place and didn't really do much of anything because they really, really hated the music. And this one, they just were falling asleep. I think for me, the variance is the important part of that you do get this variance across the pieces for individual and across individuals as well. A really strong experimentalist will hate that because it adds noise to the data, and I agree, but it's really a question of what you're trying to derive from these things. I wanted to get that subjective part. The second question about the low-level features, I mean, they do cluster together in these states, and they do vary. I didn't show the state transitions were what were used for these particular features. I don't have a slide for that, but you do see, in fact, that the presence or absence of these states across different pieces of music do vary quite a bit, which is great, because then we get is this particular point in the music really focused more on the low level aspects of the music, or is it really emphasizing the more compositional aspects, for example? And that's, again, this back and forth between the combination of the perceptual features and the combination of these compositional features or high level features is what makes music attractive to us, how a composer varies those things. The mirror toolkit has been used quite a bit, and it's quite cool. I don't think it's been used as much as it could be for these kind of things, but you can probably learn a lot from that in terms of compositional differences as well.
Yeah. Thanks.
Anything? Anyone else? Oh, there you go.
Hello.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much for this fantastic and insightful talk. It's really amazing to see this happening. Is it okay if I have like multiple questions in terms of time? Okay, good, awesome. Sorry?
My mic, yeah, it's back, okay. Sorry, go ahead.
If it's okay, I would like to go back to the manifold side of things a bit.
Of course.
In terms of that overarching approach or theory, would the idea be that we have one manifold ranging the entire cascade from primary sensory regions to higher cortical regions, or would the idea be that we have submanifolds that are basically stacked in a certain dimension along the corticofugal projection?
Yeah. That's a great question. We've had a lot of discussion, Victor and I, about that. So the manifold architectures will probably depend on spatial scales quite a bit, as well as temporal scales. Now, one could say that you've got manifolds within manifolds within manifolds, like the turtles thing, turtles of turtles all the way down. And that's probably how it's set up. The likelihood is that some of these manifolds may be changing in real time depending on the scale as well. And this probably has to do with that transition between scales. So the suspicion is that you've got sort of a set of manifolds that are relatively deterministic, that are based on the more long-lived architecture, which would be the structural connections. And then these submanifolds might change, and those are probably the ones that link different scales. So it's kind of a bit of both, I think. And that's more of an assumption than actually been proven. But what we're working on now is ways to characterize that. Instead of using these regional models, you think like neural fields, which give you a better idea of scale dependency, which we're kind of missing in a lot of the models right now. It's incredibly difficult to model that, but we have to go there at some point in time.
So regarding that, maybe a direct follow-up, would you consider maybe like reservoir computing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. You need to talk to Victor about this, because there's been a lot of work now in this eBrains consortium, which most of you probably know about. That's it's an evolving offshoot from the Human Brain Project. In that context, the intersection between high performance computing operations, things like reservoir computing to look at a better way of characterizing networks, being able to instantiate these things in neuromorphic platforms is, I think, one direction that can happen in this platform. So you can actually then merge things like virtual brain with something like a nest simulator, which does sort of the thing at a neuromorphic level. So it's an open field, a lot of opportunities there. The reservoir computing is actually one dimension that could be explored for sure.
Cool. And maybe one more, if it's okay. Sorry for all, like, if I don't.
Oh, go ahead, please. You have the mic, so you're in control.
And maybe going back a bit to, or like the intersection between manifolds and music, is the idea and also that certain factors like plasticity or familiarity with a certain music genre and experience would alter the manifold along one dimension, or like the composition of the manifold?
Mm-hmm. I didn't get the last part of that question, sorry.
Sorry, if certain factors like experience and things like that, or certain music genre likings or plasticity and training, if they would change a dimension of the manifold, or like
it would probably change how the manifolds in the brain relate to the manifolds of behavior, or in the physical part, the manifolds of the music. So that would be very much dependent on the personal, like the experience of music, familiarity, plasticity, even depending on what happens there. And I think that's why it's important to have a good characterization that's more static, which would be like the music features themselves, and then relating that to brain features and seeing how much of this is actually driven by the perceptual parts, how much of that is more individual driven, and then finding out what is the individual part of that. Is that familiarity? Is that hidden repertoires or something like that as well?
So this would also open up the chance of like altering trajectories through the manifold. I
hope so, and that's part of the a lot of efforts right now are looking at ways to actually push trajectories. Now, brain stimulation is a great example of that, because the assumption there is you're actually changing how networks are interacting. You've got deep brain stimulation, which is focused on trying to reestablish networks, but what it's actually doing is changing trajectories through the reset mechanism. And you can imagine using things like perceptual stimuli to help bias trajectories as well. And that would be a less severe way of doing it, instead of actually having to put an electrode and blasting someone's brain.
So for music, having like syntax and semantic that might act as a sort of prior for the trajectory through the manifold, this could be something like that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Thanks so much. Sorry for all the questions.
No worries. There's one on the chat, if I may. Yeah. Bert Liu says that high-level musical features may not be very accurate. So how do you solve the problem? Have you selected songs with higher accuracies of music features? Not really, no. And this is true, that the mere feature toolkit has a lot of different measures in there, and some of them are less robust across music pieces. So those ones were just basically dropped. So we only selected the high musical features that were at least robust across different pieces of music.
Okay, so if there's no other questions in the audience, and it seems like Zoom has nothing else coming forth, just would like to say thank you very much to Randy for coming all this way to give this talk, and to all of you for joining us today. There's coffee and tea and cookies on the side. Please feel free to help yourself. And if you do want to talk to Randy, I think you'll make yourself available to do that as well.
You're in charge. You're in charge.
So yeah, we'll be hanging around here. So please come say hi.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Thanks, Julie.